The news spread through Galactic Academy Station Epsilon 7 like fire through dry grass despite every attempt by security to contain it. And students whispered in corridors about the human whose eyes had glowed like stars, and who had stopped a Krell warrior's punch with one hand. And some species reacted with scientific curiosity, wanting to study this phenomenon, while others responded with fear, wondering what else humanity might be hiding. And the Krell ambassador arrived within hours demanding justice for Vorn, who claimed to have been defending himself against an unprovoked attack. And the Merchant Guild saw opportunity in the possibility of enhanced humans who could work in environments too dangerous for normal beings. And the military powers began quiet calculations about how such abilities might shift the balance of power in the galaxy. And through it all, Daesung remained in medical isolation, learning control techniques from Jiwoo, who had revealed herself as another awakened and who could phase through solid matter for brief moments. And she taught him breathing exercises and meditation practices that helped him visualize the energy flowing through his body. And she explained that emotions were not the enemy, but rather the key to control, because trying to suppress feelings only made the power more volatile, and instead he needed to acknowledge his anger and fear and joy and channel those emotions into focused intention. And it was like learning to swim where fighting the water only made you sink, but relaxing and working with the current kept you afloat. And Daesung practiced for hours, making small amounts of light appear in his palms, and then dismissing it and calling it forth again until the action became almost natural. And Jiwoo told him stories about her own awakening 3 years ago when she had fallen from a cliff during a hiking trip and had instinctively phased through the ground instead of hitting it. And she had spent months thinking she was going insane before Earth's monitoring program found her and explained what she was. And now she traveled to different academy stations pretending to be a normal student while actually serving as a mentor for newly awakened humans. And there were dozens like her scattered across the galaxy, quietly helping their own kind, while maintaining the secret that protected them all. And Daesung asked what would happen if the galactic community learned the full truth about how many awakened humans existed. And Jiwoo's expression darkened, and she admitted that nobody knew for certain, but the projections were not optimistic. And in the hallway outside his room, Ambassador Taeyang arrived with her staff, and immediately went into emergency meetings with High Chancellor Quarix and the Academy's governing board. And the ambassador was a severe woman with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen decades of diplomatic warfare. And she had built her career on protecting human interests in a galaxy that viewed her species as inexperienced children, and now she faced perhaps her greatest challenge as she sat across from Chancellor Quarix, whose amphibious features revealed nothing of his thoughts. And the Chancellor demanded to know if Earth had deliberately concealed the existence of enhanced humans from the galactic community. And Ambassador Taeyang chose her words, carefully admitting that some humans possessed unusual abilities, but framing them as rare evolutionary variations no different from the telepathic abilities of the Mindari or the regenerative powers of the Trellix. And she pointed out that many species had unique traits and that Earth had never claimed to have revealed every aspect of human biology. And furthermore, she argued that humanity had been subjected to discrimination and mockery since joining the galactic community, and perhaps if humans had been treated with more respect, they would have felt safer sharing such information. And Chancellor Quarix listened without interrupting, and then asked the question that Ambassador Taeyang had been dreading. And he wanted to know how many of these enhanced humans existed, and whether they posed a threat to other species. And the ambassador took a breath and explained that the total number was classified, but represented less than 1% of humanity's population. And these individuals were not weapons, but rather ordinary people who happened to have extraordinary abilities, and they lived normal lives and contributed to society. And the vast majority never used their powers for anything beyond personal emergencies. And the Chancellor's expression suggested he was not entirely convinced. And meanwhile, in a darkened storage room, Tessic met with a representative from Helix Corporation, which specialized in military augmentation and genetic research. And the insectoid alien had copied the footage of Daesung's awakening onto a secure drive and was negotiating a price for the data. And the corporate representative was offering enough credits to fund Tessic's education for a decade. And the transaction was almost complete when the door burst open and Pilot Sung Ho entered with a weapon drawn. And the human special forces operative moved with practiced efficiency, disarming Tessic and securing the data drive before the alien could trigger any alarms. and Sung-Ho's voice was cold as he explained that selling footage of classified human abilities was considered an act of espionage against Earth, and Tessik's translator struggled to render his terrified clicking into coherent language. And the corporate representative tried to claim diplomatic immunity, but Sung-Ho simply smiled and suggested that the representative leave the station immediately or face charges of attempted human trafficking. And after they had fled, Sung-Ho destroyed the data drive and all copies Tessik had made, and word of the incident spread quickly, increasing the galactic community's anxiety about how far humans would go to protect their secrets. And in the medical ward, Dae-sung finally received clearance to leave isolation, and Commander Yi-jun escorted him to a preparation room where he found formal clothing waiting, and the commander explained that Dae-sung had been summoned to testify before the Galactic Educational Council, and his testimony would help determine not just his own future, but potentially the future of all human participation in galactic institutions. And Ambassador Tae-yang entered the room and studied Dae-sung with sharp eyes, and she told him bluntly that some council members wanted to use this incident as justification to expel humanity from the academy system, and others wanted to impose restrictions on human movement throughout the galaxy, and what he said in that chamber would matter more than any diplomatic maneuvering she could manage. And she advised him to be honest but measured, and to present himself as a victim who had been forced to defend himself, rather than as a potential threat. And Hyo-jin helped him adjust his collar and told him he would do fine, because he had always been good at finding the right words. And Ji-woo appeared at the doorway and gave him an encouraging nod, and Dae-sung asked if there would be other awakened at the hearing, and Ambassador Tae-yang exchanged glances with Commander Yi-jun, before admitting that they had decided on a risky strategy, and if the council demanded transparency, then humanity would give them transparency. And 3 other awakened students had volunteered to reveal themselves during the hearing, to demonstrate that enhanced humans were not isolated incidents, but rather a known and managed aspect of human diversity. And Dae-sung felt his stomach drop because this went against everything the secret program had been built to prevent. And the ambassador saw his expression and told him grimly that sometimes the only way to control a narrative was to get ahead of it, and hiding would only feed suspicion while openness might build trust. And it was a gamble, but all of diplomacy was gambling, and the time came for them to walk to the council chamber. And Dae-sung moved through corridors that suddenly felt too narrow with hundreds of eyes watching him from alcoves and doorways. And whispers followed him in a dozen languages, and when they reached the massive doors of the council chamber, he could hear the buzz of conversation from within. And Ambassador Tae-yang placed a hand on his shoulder and told him to remember that he represented not just himself, but every human who had ever felt small and weak and dismissed by the galaxy, and this was his chance to show them what humans truly were. And the doors opened and Dae-sung stepped into a room filled with beings from across the known universe, all of them waiting to judge him and his entire species. The council chamber was a vast circular space designed to accommodate hundreds of beings from species that breathed different atmospheres and perceived reality through alien senses, and specialized environmental pods lined the walls, creating bubbles of custom gravity and air composition. And at the center of the room stood a platform where Dae-sung was directed to stand, and around him in ascending tiers sat representatives from dozens of civilizations, including the insectoid, Quillith and the crystalline, Luminar and the gaseous Nephrim, who communicated through color, changes in their containment vessels, and High Chancellor Quarix called the session to order with a gesture of his webbed hand, and the translation devices embedded throughout the chamber rendered his words into every known language simultaneously, and he stated that they were gathered to address a matter of significant concern regarding the human student Dae-sung and the abilities he had displayed. And before proceeding with testimony, the council would hear from General Karn, who had traveled from the Krell homeworld to advocate for his son Vorn. And the massive warrior entered through a side door that barely accommodated his bulk, and his violet skin was marked with ceremonial scars that denoted his rank and achievements. And he spoke in the grinding language of his people about honor and trust, and the sacred responsibility of educational institutions to protect students from hidden dangers. And he claimed that his son had merely engaged in traditional Krell sparring, which involved testing an opponent's strength. And by concealing the existence of enhanced humans, Earth had created a dangerous situation where normal interactions could trigger violent responses. And Vorn himself stood behind his father, looking smaller and less confident than he had in the arena, and General Karn demanded that humans be restricted from physical activities with other species until a full biological assessment could be completed, and several council members nodded in agreement while others appeared skeptical. And then Ambassador Tae Yang rose to speak, and her voice carried the weight of authority earned through years of navigating galactic politics, and she began by acknowledging that humanity should perhaps have been more forthcoming about genetic variations within their population, and however she pointed out that the awakened represented a tiny fraction of humans, and that their abilities emerged unpredictably, making systematic disclosure nearly impossible, and furthermore she noted that many species present in this chamber possessed abilities that could be considered dangerous, including the Krell's incredible strength and the Mindari's telepathy and the Trellix's ability to regenerate from catastrophic injuries. And yet none of these species were restricted or quarantined because the galactic community understood that abilities alone did not define intent. And she argued that Daesung had been assaulted by students who viewed him as weak and wanted to humiliate him, and his awakening was pure self-defense triggered by genuine mortal danger, and to punish him for surviving an attack would set a precedent that victims could be blamed for defending themselves. And the chamber erupted in competing voices as various representatives expressed their opinions, and Chancellor Korix called for order and then turned his ancient eyes toward Daesung, and he asked the human student to explain in his own words what had occurred. And Daesung stepped forward and began to speak, letting the translation devices carry his voice throughout the chamber. And he described the 3 months he had spent at the academy, enduring casual cruelty and systematic dismissal. And he talked about being tripped in hallways and mocked in classes and treated as though his presence was an amusing curiosity rather than a legitimate student. And he explained that he had tried to follow the rules and ignore the harassment, because he believed that humanity's reputation depended on him proving that humans could succeed through merit and determination. And then he recounted the incident in the arena, including the moment when Vorn's punch had collapsed his lung, and how the desperate need to survive had triggered something deep in his genetics. And he admitted honestly that he had not known such abilities existed within him, and that even now he was struggling to control the power that had awakened. And his voice remained steady as he spoke, but his hands trembled slightly, and Ambassador Tae Yang watched him with an expression that mixed pride and concern. And when he finished, there was a moment of silence before Elder Vix spoke. And the ancient philosopher was one of the most respected beings in the galaxy, having witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations over his centuries of life. And he asked the question that everyone had been thinking, and he wanted to know how many humans possessed these abilities, and whether Earth had any accurate count. And Daesung looked at Ambassador Tae Yang, who gave him a subtle nod. And he answered honestly, saying that Earth's monitoring programs had identified individuals with genetic markers suggesting potential for awakening, but that the actual number who would ever manifest abilities was unknown, because most lived their entire lives without triggering the dormant genes. And Elder Vix pressed further, asking if there were other awakened humans currently at the academy. And before Daesung could answer, Jiwoo stood up from her seat in the observer section, and she announced clearly that she was one of the awakened, and that she had been at the academy for 2 years without incident. And a male student named Tae-min rose from another section and admitted he could move at superhuman speeds when necessary. And a third student appeared via hologram from a different academy station and revealed her ability to generate protective force fields. And the chamber descended into chaos as representatives shouted questions and accusations, and some demanded immediate expulsion of all human students while others called for scientific studies. And several militant species made thinly veiled threats about the need to contain humanity before they became too powerful. And Chancellor Korix struggled to restore order, while Ambassador Tae Yang's face remained carefully neutral, even as her hands gripped the edges of her podium. And just as the Chancellor was about to call for a vote on restrictive measures, the station's alarm system activated with a wailing siren that cut through all other sounds, and emergency lights began flashing in patterns that indicated external threat. And a technician's voice came over the chamber's communication system, announcing that an unknown fleet had entered the sector and was approaching at high speed. And the massive display screens that dominated one wall flickered to life, showing sensor data of dozens of organic-looking ships that moved with unsettling coordination, and someone identified them as Ravik swarm vessels. And the name sent a wave of fear through the chamber, because the Ravix were a hive-mind species that viewed other civilizations as resources to be consumed. And they rarely ventured this close to Academy stations, because the defensive fleets usually kept them at bay, and the tactical display showed that the station's defense ships were already engaging, but were being overwhelmed by sheer numbers, and explosions blossomed in the black void of space as Ravix weapons tore through shields and hull plating, and Chancellor Quarix immediately called for evacuation procedures, while military representatives began coordinating with their respective fleets, and General Karn was already moving toward the exit preparing to join the defense, and Ambassador Taeyang grabbed Daesung's arm and started pulling him toward the diplomatic escape pods. But Daesung pulled free and looked at Jiwoo and Taemin, who both nodded, understanding what he was thinking. And Commander Yijun appeared from the security detail and told them firmly that they were not soldiers and needed to evacuate. And Daesung felt the power humming under his skin, and remembered the fear in Vorn's eyes when he had caught that punch. And he asked the commander if humans were really going to run away while students and faculty died. And Yijun's expression hardened, and he looked at each of the young awakened in turn. And he told them that if they were going to fight, they would do it smart, not brave. And he began issuing tactical instructions while around them the station shuddered from impacts as Ravix boarding craft attached to the outer hull like parasites. And through the chamber's windows, Daesung could see the organic shapes of enemy vessels blotting out the stars. And he realized that the galaxy was about to see what humans could really do when they stopped hiding. The Ravix breached the station's hull in 3 locations simultaneously, and their warriors poured through the gaps like insects boiling from a disturbed nest. And these creatures stood on multiple segmented legs with razor-sharp claws and mandibles that could shear through most known metals, and they moved with perfect coordination guided by the queen mind that controlled them from the flagship, and station security forces engaged them immediately. But conventional weapons barely slowed the swarm, and evacuation alarms screamed through every corridor as civilians fled toward the designated safe zones. And Daesung ran through the chaos with Jiwoo and Taemin, following Commander Yijun, who was coordinating defense efforts through his communication device. And they reached a major intersection, just as a wave of Ravix warriors turned the corner. And the creatures saw them and charged without hesitation, and Daesung felt the power surge through him as his eyes began to glow and he thrust both hands forward, releasing a blast of concussive energy that caught the leading Ravix and sent them tumbling backward into their fellows. And Jiwoo phased through the wall and appeared behind the confused warriors, striking at their vulnerable joints. And Taemin became a blur of motion, moving so fast that he seemed to be in 3 places at once. And together the 3 awakened humans carved through the swarm in ways that made Commander Yijun stop and stare. And more security forces arrived, including several Krell warriors who had been stationed at the academy. And Vorn was among them, carrying a plasma rifle that looked almost comically small in his massive hands. And he saw Daesung surrounded by flickering energy, and for a moment their eyes met. And then Vorn nodded once and turned his weapon on the Ravix, showing that whatever had happened between them before was less important than survival. And they fought their way down 3 levels toward a section where civilians were trapped behind a collapsed bulkhead. And Daesung used his energy to blast through the debris, while Taemin evacuated people faster than seemed physically possible. And Jiwoo phased through walls to scout ahead and warn them of ambushes. And behind them, Vorn and his Krell companions provided covering fire that kept the swarm from overwhelming their position. And in the command center, Hyojin worked frantically at a tactical console, coordinating evacuation routes and trying to predict where the Ravix would strike next. And she had always been better with information than combat. And now her skills were saving lives as she directed civilians away from breach points and guided security teams to critical intersections. And Ambassador Taeyang stood beside her, making decisions that would have taken committees hours to debate. And she authorized the use of experimental weapons and opened sealed sections of the station to create choke points and sent distress signals to every human vessel within range. And the nearest was Captain Minseo's stealth ship, which had been shadowing the station for weeks as part of the security detail. And now it dropped its cloaking field and streaked toward the battle, and in the main hangar bay, hundreds of students and faculty were boarding evacuation ships while security forces held a desperate perimeter, and the Ravix Queen Mind recognized this as a critical point and redirected massive forces toward the hangar. And Daesung and his group arrived just as the new wave hit, and he saw immediately that there were too many, and they were coming too fast. And he told the others to get people onto the ships while he bought them time. and Jiwoo started to argue, but he was already running toward the approaching swarm, and his eyes blazed like twin suns as he gathered every bit of energy he could hold, and the Ravix warriors saw him and changed their formation to focus on this obvious threat, and they came at him in a chittering wave of claws and mandibles, and Daesung released his power in controlled bursts, striking clusters of warriors and using the energy to enhance his physical movements, and he was not trained in combat the way soldiers were, but desperation and instinct guided him. And the Ravix kept coming, and he kept fighting until his body ached and his energy reserves began to falter. And a warrior's claw caught him across the ribs, opening a deep gash that bled freely, and pain exploded through him, but he pushed it aside and kept moving. And another claw struck his shoulder and then his leg, and he was going down, and he knew it, and the swarm surged forward, ready to finish him, and then a voice he did not recognize screamed with such force that the air itself seemed to shatter. And Jae-hee, who was only 15 and had been huddled with other students waiting to evacuate, had just awakened. And her scream manifested as a telekinetic shockwave that radiated outward in a perfect sphere, and Ravix warriors were pulverized against walls or flung into space through the breached sections of hangar. And the girl collapsed immediately afterward, unconscious from the expenditure, and other students rushed to protect her while Daesung struggled to his feet. And that was when Captain Minseo's ship roared into the hangar bay with weapons blazing. And the sleek vessel was not designed for direct combat, but its pilot was making it work through sheer skill and aggression, and the ship's guns tore through Ravix formations while its engines scattered others with superheated exhaust. And the rear hatch opened, and Colonel Bora led a full squad of human marines into the fray, and these soldiers wore powered armor and carried weapons that spoke of serious military funding, and they moved with the coordinated precision of professionals who had trained together for years. And Daesung watched in exhausted amazement as these ordinary humans without any enhanced abilities cut through the Ravix with ruthless efficiency, and they used tactics and technology and teamwork to overcome enemies that were individually superior. And Colonel Bora reached Daesung and pulled him behind cover while a medic began treating his wounds. And the colonel told him that reinforcements were arriving from 3 different human task forces. And Ambassador Tae Yang had pulled strings that Daesung could not imagine to get military assets here this quickly. And the battle raged for another 20 minutes while evacuation ships launched and fled to safe distance. And the Ravix Queen Mind aboard the flagship recognized that the attack had failed and began withdrawing her forces. And as the warriors retreated, Daesung saw something that made him push the medic away and stand despite his injuries. And through the hangar's atmospheric shield, he could see the massive organic shape of the Queen Mind's command vessel, and he understood on some instinctive level that if that ship escaped, it would return with a larger force, and he limped toward the edge of the hangar while gathering what little energy he had left. And Jiwoo shouted at him to stop, but he could not stop because this mattered in ways he could not explain. And he reached the atmospheric barrier that shimmered between vacuum and breathable air, and he extended both hands toward the retreating flagship, and every cell in his body screamed in protest as he pulled energy from his own life force, and his eyes blazed so brightly that people had to look away, and then he released everything in a focused beam that crossed the distance to the enemy ship in an instant, and the energy struck the vessel's organic hull and burned through it like a cutting torch, and secondary explosions rippled across the ship as critical systems failed, and the flagship began listing in leaking atmosphere, and Daesung watched it begin to drift powerless before his vision went dark and he collapsed. And he woke 3 days later in the same medical ward where this had all begun, and his body was wrapped in bandages and connected to devices that monitored his recovery. And the room was full of flowers and small gifts from species across the station, and Dr. Myung smiled when she saw his eyes open and told him he had become something of a hero. And the council had held emergency sessions while he slept, and after much debate they had decided that humans could continue participating in galactic institutions, and the awakened would be registered and monitored not as weapons, but as individuals who needed specialized support and training. And it was not a perfect solution, but it was better than expulsion or quarantine. And Ambassador Tai Yang visited and told him that he had changed the game by showing the galaxy that humans would stand and fight when it mattered. And respect came from demonstrated capability, not from hiding or pleading. And Vorn came to apologize formally in front of witnesses, and the Krell warrior admitted that his species valued strength above all else and he had gravely underestimated humans. And he offered a traditional Krell gesture of respect that involved exposing his throat in a sign of trust. And Daesung accepted the apology, and told Vorn that he hoped they could move forward without hostility. And Hyojin visited every day, bringing news and updates and homework that made Daesung laugh because of course she would worry about his grades. And Jiwoo came with Taemin and young Jae-hee, who was recovering from her own awakening. And they talked about forming a support group for awakened students, so nobody would have to face this alone. And Elder Vic sent a message saying that the galaxy had needed to see humanity's fire, and that too long had humans endured dismissal and mockery in silence. And now the other species understood that humanity was not weak, just... Taeyang wiped the sweat from his forehead as he climbed deeper into the mountain cave, and the air grew colder with each step he took into the darkness, and his flashlight beam cut through the black like a knife through silk, and he could hear Hana's voice crackling through his radio telling him to be careful and to not go too far ahead of the team. But Taeyang had always been the type to push forward and to discover what lay beyond the next corner. And today was no different than any other day in his career as an archaeologist who had spent 15 years digging through the past, looking for answers to questions most people never thought to ask. And this cave in the remote mountains of Korea had been calling to him for 3 months, ever since the local villagers reported strange lights coming from deep within the stone. And at first the university had dismissed it as superstition or maybe just phosphorescent minerals. But Taeyang had convinced them to fund a small expedition, and now here he was crawling through passages that no human had touched in thousands of years, and maybe no human had ever been here at all. And that thought made his heart race with excitement and fear in equal measure, because what if he found something that changed everything, and what if he found nothing at all and wasted everyone's time and money and reputation? But he pushed those thoughts away and focused on moving forward and on not tripping over the loose rocks that covered the cave floor like ancient teeth waiting to bite. And Hana called again asking for his position, and he told her he was maybe 200 meters from the entrance and going deeper. And she said the readings on her equipment were going strange and that maybe he should come back and they could return tomorrow with better gear. But Taeyang laughed and said he was fine, and that he just wanted to see what was around the next bend, and then he would come back and help them set up camp for the night. And she sighed in that way she always did when he was being stubborn and said fine. But be quick about it and keep your radio on. And he promised he would. And then he turned the corner, and his breath caught in his throat, because the narrow passage opened into a chamber so vast his flashlight could barely reach the far wall, and the ceiling disappeared into blackness above him, and in the center of the chamber was a pool of water that glowed with a soft blue light that pulsed like a heartbeat. And Taeyang stood frozen at the entrance, unable to believe what he was seeing. Because this was impossible, and this was beyond anything he had ever encountered in his career, and the walls were covered in symbols that seemed to move in the corner of his vision. And when he tried to focus on them, they became still and solid and angular, and unlike any writing system he had ever studied, and he had studied them all from ancient Korean to Sumerian to Egyptian hieroglyphs. And these were none of those. And yet somehow they felt familiar in a way he could not explain. And he walked slowly toward the pool, and his footsteps echoed in the vast space, and the sound seemed to take forever to fade, and the water continued to pulse with that strange blue light. And now that he was closer, he could see that the light came from within the water itself, and not from any external source. And there were no fish and no plants and nothing living that he could see. And yet the water moved slightly, as if something stirred beneath the surface, and he knelt beside the pool and reached out to touch the water. And it was warm, and it felt like touching silk, or maybe electricity, and he pulled his hand back quickly and wiped it on his pants, and called Hana on the radio, and told her she needed to come see this, and she asked what it was, and he said he did not know how to describe it, and she needed to just come and see. And she said she was on her way, and to not touch anything until she got there, and he said okay, but he was lying, because even as he said it, he was leaning forward again and cupping his hands and dipping them into the pool, and the water felt alive against his skin, and it seemed to call to him in a language older than words, and he knew he should wait, and he knew this was foolish and dangerous and against every protocol they had, but something in him needed to know and needed to taste this water and to understand what it was and where it came from, and so he lifted his hands to his lips and drank, and the water tasted like starlight. If starlight had a taste, and like electricity. If electricity could be swallowed, and it burned going down his throat. But it was a good burn, like strong liquor or hot. Soup on a cold day, and he felt it spread through his body like fire through dry grass, and then he heard it. And the voice came from behind him, and it spoke in perfect Korean, and it said, "Your life will never be yours again." And Taeyang spun around. So fast he almost fell into the pool, and his flashlight swept across the empty chamber. And there was no one there and nothing there except the symbols on the walls, which now seemed to glow with the same blue light as the water. And he called out, asking who was there and asking who had spoken. But no one answered, and the chamber was silent except for his own breathing, which had become fast and shallow and panicked. And he grabbed his radio and tried to call Hana, but his fingers would not work properly, and the radio slipped from his hand and clattered on the stone, and then the pain started, and it was like nothing he had ever felt before, and it started in his chest, and spread outward through his arms and legs and into his head, and he fell to his knees and then to his side, and his vision went white and then black and then white again. And he could hear someone screaming and realized it was him, and he tried to stop, but he could not. And the pain grew worse and worse until he thought he would die. And maybe he did die, and maybe this was what death felt like, and then everything went dark and cold and silent. And the last thing he remembered was the voice speaking again, and it said, "The first trial has begun, and you will either rise or you will fall, and there is no middle ground and no turning back." And then there was nothing at all, and Taeyang floated in darkness for a time that could have been seconds or hours or years. And when he finally opened his eyes, again he was lying on his back staring up at a gray sky, and Hana was leaning over him crying and calling his name and asking him to please wake up and please be okay. And he tried to speak, but his throat was raw and his voice came out as a whisper, and he asked how he got out of the cave, and she said she found him at the entrance and he had been unconscious for almost an hour, and the medical team was on the way. And he tried to sit up, but she pushed him back down and told him to stay still and rest, and he closed his eyes and felt the world spinning around him. And somewhere deep inside his body something had changed, and something new had awakened, and he knew with absolute certainty that the voice had been right, and his life would never be his own again. 3 days passed before Taeyang truly woke, and when he did, he found himself in a white room that smelled of antiseptic and medicine, and Hana was asleep in a chair beside his bed, and her head rested on her arms on the edge of his mattress, and he could see the dark circles under her eyes and knew she had not been sleeping well, and probably had been sitting here watching him for all 3 days. And the thought made him feel guilty and grateful at the same time, and he reached out to touch her shoulder but stopped when he saw his hand, and it looked the same as it always had, and yet it felt different somehow. And the air around his fingers seemed to shimmer slightly like heat waves rising from hot pavement, and he stared at his hand, trying to understand what he was seeing. And then Hana stirred and opened her eyes, and when she saw he was awake, she sat up so fast, she almost knocked over the chair, and she grabbed his hand and squeezed it, and asked him how he felt, and if he knew where he was and what day it was, and he told her he felt strange, but okay. And he was obviously in a hospital, and he had no idea what day it was, and she laughed and cried at the same time and said it was Wednesday, and he had been unconscious since Sunday night, and the doctors had been worried and had run every test they could think of, but could not find anything wrong with him, and his body temperature had been dangerously low when they brought him in. But now it was normal, and all. His vital signs were perfect, and it was like nothing had happened at all, except he had been asleep for 3 days, and she had been so scared, and Taeyang squeezed her hand back and told her he was sorry, and he should have listened to her and should not have drunk from the pool, and she asked what pool and what was he talking about. And he realized she did not remember, and he asked her what she remembered about finding him, and she said she had followed him into the cave and found him lying at the entrance, and he was cold and not breathing well, and she had called for help, and they had carried him out and brought him here, and that was all she knew. And when he asked about the chamber and the glowing pool, she looked at him with confusion and said there was no chamber, and the cave was just a simple tunnel that went back maybe 50 meters and then ended, and there was nothing special about it at all. And Taeyang felt ice run through his veins because he knew what he had seen, and he knew what he had experienced, and he knew it was real. And yet Hana was telling him none of it existed, and he wondered if he had dreamed the whole thing, and if maybe he had fallen and hit his head and hallucinated everything. But then why did his body feel so different? And why could he see the shimmer in the air, and why could he hear the electric hum of the lights overhead like they were singing? And why could he understand the conversation happening in the hallway outside his room, even though it was in English and he had never been good at English and had always struggled with it in school? And yet now he understood every word perfectly, and he could also hear someone speaking what sounded like Japanese 3 rooms down. And he understood that too, and this was impossible, and this was wrong, and he needed to figure out what was happening to him. And Dr. Minho came in then, and he was a kind man with gray hair and glasses, and he smiled when he saw Taiyang was awake, and he did all the usual doctor things like checking his eyes and his reflexes and listening to his heart and lungs and asking him questions about how he felt and if anything hurt, and Taeyang said no and everything felt fine and actually better than fine, and he felt amazing and full of energy, and Dr. Minho nodded and said that was good, and they would keep him for observation for another day or two just to be safe, and then he could probably go home, and Taeyang agreed. But he did not tell the doctor about the strange things he was experiencing, because he did not know how to explain them, and he was afraid they would think he was crazy and keep him here longer. And he needed to get out, and he needed to understand what had happened to him in that cave. And over the next 2 days, he discovered more changes, and his reaction time had increased dramatically. And when a nurse dropped a tray of instruments, he caught 3 of them before they hit the ground, and moved so fast the nurse screamed. And the other changes were subtler, and he could see in the dark now and could feel electromagnetic fields around electronic devices, and could sense when people were about to enter his room seconds before they did. And the dreams were the worst part, and when he slept, he saw things that could not be real, and he saw vast cities on distant worlds and ships that moved between stars and wars that raged across galaxies, and millions of beings dying in fire and light, and he saw Earth from space and saw it being watched by something ancient and patient and hungry. And he woke from these dreams covered in sweat and shaking, and Hana asked him what was wrong, and he told her it was nothing and just bad dreams. But he knew they were more than dreams, and they were memories but not his memories, and they belonged to something else, and something that had lived long ago, and that something had left its mark in the water he drank, and now that mark was inside him, changing him and rewriting who he was. And on the 3rd day, Dr. Minho came to take a blood sample, and Taeyang watched as the doctor drew the dark red liquid into the vial. And when Dr. Minho took it to the analysis machine in the corner of the room, something went wrong, and the machine started making a high-pitched whining sound, and then it sparked and smoke poured from its vents, and Dr. Minho cursed and unplugged it quickly and looked at Taeyang with confusion and said he did not understand, and the machine was new and had been working perfectly. And Taeyang said maybe it was just a coincidence, but he knew it was not. And he knew his blood had done something to the machine, and that night, after everyone had gone home, except for the night staff, Taeyang got out of bed and walked to the laboratory, and he was not supposed to be there, but no one stopped him. And he found his blood sample in the refrigerator, and he took it to another machine and ran the analysis himself. And what he saw on the screen made his heart stop, because his DNA was wrong, and it had extra sequences that should not exist, and sequences that did not match any known terrestrial life, and the sequences were still changing and still growing. And he understood then that he was becoming something new, and something that had never existed before, and he was no longer fully human, and he heard the voice again, and it came from inside his head this time and not from outside, and it said, "They are coming, and you must prepare your species, and this is your purpose now, and you were chosen because you were ready, and because you were willing to drink and to take the risk, and now you must live with the consequences, and you must become what humanity needs you to be." And Taeyang wanted to scream and wanted to run and wanted to tear this thing out of him, but he knew he could not, and he knew the voice was right and something was coming, and he was the only one who could help, and the only one who had been changed, and the only one who could stand between humanity and whatever darkness was approaching. And he looked at his hands again and watched them shimmer and change, and he felt the power growing inside him, and he knew his life would never be his own again, and he knew he would have to embrace this change and learn to use it and become the weapon that humanity did not yet know it needed.